What's good? It's Fevir. Let's talk about Firefall. I have to quickly say before I get started that I do have a bias towards Firefall, not so much because I love the game, but because I love gaming and I believe that Firefall is good for gaming as a whole. Now, how that pans out for Firefall specifically is a bit of a toss-up. Now, I've played Firefall on and off through most of the beta, and with its release I decided to check back in before I talked about it because Firefall has a habit of changing things up drastically often. It's one of the things I admire so much about Firefall, that they're not afraid to just try new things and gamble on features, and if it doesn't work out, then they just change it down the line. Now, some general information about the game is that Firefall is a free-to-play MMO shooter hybrid from the gaming studio Red 5. It combines most of the current generation defining features of an MMO, things like class systems, a gear-based progression system, special abilities, crafting, questing, group dungeons, raids, and practically any mainstay you can think of, with the core defining features of a shooter: skill-based combat, headshots, clip sizes, reload speed, fast and frantic gameplay. The MMO elements at first glance seem to be dumbed down, but they actually offer great depth. This allows players lured in by the shooting mechanics to grasp things like equipment easily without being overwhelmed. For instance, this game has one equipment slot and a primary and secondary weapon slot. World of Warcraft, for instance, has 18 equipment slots on the paper doll alone, so it comes across much less daunting. However, each piece of equipment and your abilities can be augmented with some crazy power-ups. You can add weapon splash or increased AoE radius, increased movement speed, increased rate of fire or magazine, or increase your jetpack efficiency. Oh, did I mention this game has fucking jetpacks? Because this game has fucking jetpacks. Most of these air quote stats have a non-numerical impact on the combat and non-combat gameplay that Firefall has. So there seems to be less options, which would make you think it's a less complex and more shallow MMO experience, kind of a trade-off for being focused on shooting. But because of the impact of each decision, it actually adds up to being a much more substantial system than having to just equip close to 20 different stat sticks. Now, this is just one example of an MMO system that's altered to make it work in Firefall. In the past, other games have tried to marry these genres together to varying degrees. PlanetSide 2 is successful, but it feels like a shooter with MMO talents sort of tacked on. Tabula Rasa tried to fuse these genres together, but it never quite felt right, and so it crashed and burned. Firefall does feel right. Nothing feels tacked on. In fact, the game plays great if you're coming from an MMO or coming from a shooter. The game's combat is shooter first, so you aren't rolling an invisible die to see if you hit an enemy when you hit an enemy. This, like a lot of features, is good and bad for Firefall. It makes combat feel awesome. Much less RNG than you're used to seeing in an MMO, with a focus on shooter mechanics. Quick reflexes, aiming, dodging, using your jetpack to crawl up that Z-axis, and utilizing cover can cause a quick skirmish to really get your blood pumping. But enemy AI in games isn't always good, and Firefall is no exception. Sometimes the enemies are just stupid. In fact, some of the party dungeons can be soloed by exploiting that awful AI. And I know that AI in all games is generally bad, but because of the type of combat that Firefall has, it is so much worse. It can be downright frustrating because you're not playing against humans, you're playing against really bad bots. And if you've ever played a game where you're playing against the bots and the bots just aren't believable, the difficulty can sometimes just not be there, and it really takes you out of the amazing combat experience that does exist. Now, I touched on the genre melding and a bit of the combat and AI, but I don't really want to go down a feature list with Firefall. I want to talk to you about what really defines Firefall and is its greatest strength and its greatest weakness: dynamic content. So in Firefall, there is a comparable quest system. There are job boards scattered around the map that offer different level ranged missions. You can choose from them and take on a singular mission at a time, and this mission is preset, and aside from a large amount of travel between objectives, is very similar to a quest line in any other MMO. Where dynamic content comes in is that much of the Firefall content happens randomly and for different reasons. So you could be on a job board mission to track down some poachers, but the game is designed around stuff happening as you're doing that. So as you travel to find those poachers, you could find spots where giant boss type enemies will spawn, or come across an NPC being attacked, but you'll be rewarded if you can kill the attackers before he dies. You could find a damaged vehicle that you can repair if you manage to collect the parts scattered around nearby, or even take on bandit camps, culminating in fighting the leader that gives you the right to loot their camp if you're successful. This and more can just be stumbled upon as you track down those poachers. It all just spawns randomly on the map. In addition, there are full-fledged dynamic missions that are marked on the map that spawn randomly as well. These can range from having to enter a cave or a laboratory to retrieve an item, crack a puzzle, or kill a boss, or maybe you come across a crazy melding tornado that you need to find a way to stop. Or a more unique option is that there's a form of resource collection in this game called thumping, and this happens when a player places down an item and needs to defend a point for a couple of minutes, and players can clearly see when a player is thumping and can choose to either help and defend or not. Helping will earn resources based on the location of the thumping, but I guess what I'm trying to get across is that there's all this other stuff that's happening and is just waiting for you to uncover as you are tracking down those poachers. A job mission board that, if sped through, might take 15 minutes, now takes 2 hours because you've dived into all the content you were presented as you were walking around. Now, the dynamic missions also have another side effect. Because some of them are marked on the map, some players will opt to bypass the job board and just travel from dynamic mission to dynamic mission. So you'll get these larger groupings of players that are working together inadvertently. It makes you play with others, but even if you're playing solo, you share in the rewards. It doesn't require a party. It feels good and helps facilitating meeting new players. Now, something that was in beta and probably will be added into release at some point in some form is defending your map. All players in Firefall are of the same friendly faction. Now, there's also this NPC faction, the Chosen, or the main threat, that used to actively be trying to conquer your map, and pushing M and checking out the map, you could see the map being taken over. Now, details aside, they would stage invasions, they'd attack towns, forts, and towers, and limit your access to the map and job boards, preventing what players could actually do in the game. You could spend your entire night of gaming just helping keep control and push back the Chosen, and it wasn't unusual to log in at like 3 a.m. and see that your map was completely overrun and you didn't have any options on what to do until you pushed the Chosen back. This was some of the most fun and compelling gameplay I've ever had, and I imagine that as the story has progressed in Firefall, we'll see it come back. But the point of just mentioning this is to say that Firefall and Red 5's philosophy on content isn't to make static pieces to consume and then forget about. They are creating a library of events and content that happen randomly and reactionary, like Skyrim if it was based around its awful Radiant quest system. It's a gamble, but it's kept me excited and checking in on the game every couple of weeks and keeping tabs on its progress. Okay, raving aside, I said that this was its greatest strength and weakness. So what's bad about it? Well, it can get repetitive. Sure, the game might have 20 or 30 odd dynamic events that happen in a multitude of locations and play out differently, but how many times do you really get excited about repairing a broken down vehicle or somehow stopping a tornado with your gun? The way the system works is that it is fun until it's not. And it's a tough break because playing through this stuff for the first time, my thought was, oh my god, this is the coolest shit ever, as I ran into thing after thing after thing. But after an amount of time, I knew what those things were, and I started to pick and choose the things that I wanted to do and the things that I hated. And after a while, dynamic events were just random static events. This, coupled with the large travel time between these missions to help facilitate you running into more dynamic stuff, it hurts. And I don't know what the answer to this question or this issue is, because problems aside, it's a really great system. Adding more events would create a longer time until it's no longer fun, but the problem still remains. It starts to feel like a grind. The travel time and the repetitive nature are probably the two most glaring and most documented negatives about Firefall. Now, an aside here for a lot of players who have played or reviewed Firefall is that as of about 2 weeks ago, there was a mod that allowed players to travel basically between servers and cherry pick the dynamic events. However, that mod has now been broken. I mention this because a lot of players were unaware that this mod existed, so they could play through and not get any cool dynamic events that were happening because players were stealing them from their server. So you would really feel that travel time, as you didn't get to see the stuff that broke it up, so you didn't even get to see half the content. So bear that in mind when you've looked at other reviews, or if you've played the game prior to this and just found the game world sort of empty. The thing about Firefall is that the idea of it and what it's trying to do is so cool. A dynamic world combining the best of two amazing genres in a world of cel-shaded awesomeness, killing bugs, jetpacking around on personalized mech armor suits. It's just nuts. I highly recommend, if you have a couple of buddies, try the game out. Remember, it's free. And like I said, and this is the most clear way to review this game, is that Firefall is fun until it's not. You don't need to wait until level cap to really experience what the game has to offer. Just jump in, mess around, and if you only get a week or 2 weeks or a month out of it, great. And I bet, like me, even if you stop playing, you'll be interested in where the game goes and what the game does, because it's so outside the box that as you're playing, you just see all this potential and you want to see what happens with it. Firefall, it's like we're Hisoka and this motherfucker is gone. Alright, obscure reference. Until next time, this is Fevir. Peace.